Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we are live now. I want to thank everyone who is joining us on this Civismo webinar. And most of all, I want to thank two of America's foremost experts on national security and U.S.-European relations. James Carafano and Ian Brzezinski are with us. James is with us. You can see him on the screen. Ian is joining us on the phone. He's called in, so you'll be able to get Ian's thoughts as well as James's, although you can't see him on the screen, so just bear with us as we communicate in this manner. James and Ian have co-authored a number of op-eds and a number of reports over the years looking at how Europe and America could achieve a stronger, deeper transatlantic partnership. And more recently, we've co-authored an op-ed on the Hill where they argue for what they have termed a U.S.-European partnership program. I'm going to briefly introduce our guests, and then I'll turn it over to James, who's going to walk us through just what they mean by this so-called U.S.-European partnership program. James Carafano holds an MA in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College, as well as an MA in British and Early Modern European History from Georgetown University. He also holds a PhD in Diplomatic History, by the way. He served 25 years in the Army, including in Europe. He's a lieutenant colonel. During his time in the Army, he was a head speechwriter for the Army Chief of Staff. And in 2009, he joined the Heritage Foundation, where he now leads all of Heritage's defense and foreign policy work. Ian Brzezinski holds a BA from Williams College and a MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School. He has worked at the National Security Council. He's worked in the Senate on Senator William Roth's legislative staff, as well as on the Foreign Relations Committee back in the 90s. And he was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy for much of George W. Bush's administration, right, in the early 2000s. And today, Ian is a resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council's Center for Strategy and Security, as well as serving in the Council's Strategic Advisors Group. So, James, can you walk us through what is your idea of a U.S.-European Partnership Recovery Program, and what exactly you are advocating for to achieve that?
Well, buenos dias and gracias. The first thing I want to do is assure people that Ian is the much better looking of the two of us, so bummer for you guys. But I think there's two things that really animated what we were thinking about, why we thought that talking about U.S.-European cooperation is particularly important now, particularly in a post-COVID environment. And one of them is clearly economic. We are experiencing an economic condition that is virtually without historical precedent. We have had depressions. We have had recessions. I don't know anybody who's ever done a suppression where we've all essentially voluntarily turned off our economies, and now we're going to throw a switch and turn them back on and hope for the best. I think we want to take a maximalist approach in response to that, in the sense that let's just not hope that things turn out go. Let's do everything possible to ensure a successful economic reboot. And, for the United States, it is not just about the American economy. And even the most vociferous nationalistic voices that you hear in the United States that talk about, bring the supply back home and everything else, when you start talking about the specifics of that, it's very clear that they recognize the importance of international economic engagement, of supply chains, of cooperative cooperative agreements. And for the United States, there are a couple that are absolutely crucial. Of course, one is for us is U.S., Canada, Mexico, because essentially that is one big industrial base. But the U.S.-European transatlantic economic cooperation is absolutely vital for U.S. economic recovery, and I think it's deeply important for European economic recovery too. So there's a powerful economic argument about why moving forward would be really important. The other thing I think is there's a tremendous strategic argument. I mean, we cannot deal with the issues of the world if we are not strong. So whether it's Russia or the problems in the Middle East or the encroachment of China or dealing with these countries in an equitable manner that protects our equities, we have to be strong to do that. So transatlantic economic rebooting, I think, must happen. What Ian tried to do, and I give Ian a lot of credit for this, is really introduce some fresh thinking into the equation, that this is not about kind of traditional foreign assistance, like when we saw with the Marshall Plan back in the 1940s. We need an economic recovery plan that's appropriate for our times, and one that is feasible and is something that we can quickly jump on. In the United States, we call this shovel-ready projects. So we really divided them into 3 areas: invest, engage, enable. So invest is, let's talk about economically viable projects that are going to put people to work, stimulate our economies, and have real-term benefits in terms of infrastructure, whether it's digital, physical infrastructure, or other joint economic activity. So the United States should be investing, and there's still a lot of liquidity on the sidelines here. So when the U.S. government looks and invests, that's a signal to our private sector that that's a place where they should be going and investing as well. So invest, engage. We should be talking with our European partners. What can we do together? What can we work on that is going to get our economies going again? And the other one is enable. Let's take away the restrictions and obstacles that prevent us from doing business with each other. There's a lot of talk in the world today about moving supply chains. Don't let somebody do business with this country or that country. I think rather than talking about, let's come up with rules to talk about why we can't do business with people, let's talk about creating the relationships where we want to do business with countries that are our friends, our allies, dependable partners that are going to add resiliency and add prosperity. So that was the framework that we came up with. And then what we started going is let's find projects that fit into that. So I'd like to pass it to Ian at this point, because I think the 3 C's initiative, which was something that was already on the table, really fits extremely well into the kind, as an exemplar of the kinds of things that we think will really work. Is that fair?
And I'll just remind folks before turning over to Ian, that the 3 C's initiative, which plays a major role in your case for this partnership recovery program, is something that you've been working on for a number of years, right? You've looked at the issue, and if you could remind our audience kind of what the 3 C's initiative is and what it tries to achieve, and then the role it plays within your plan.
Sure. Let me just add a couple points first to what Jim said. In facts and figures. I mean, this COVID crisis is huge. I mean, these figures in the news, it's good to remind ourselves. In the United States, 1.6 million cases today and 95,000 deaths. In Europe, it's 1.8 billion cases and 106,000 deaths. We have an economic impact globally of a downward shift to the economy, global economy by 10% predicted for this year. 6% for the United States this year, and almost 8% for Europe this year. We're seeing unemployment rates on both sides of the Atlantic match what we saw in the United States during the Depression. And as Jim was saying, this is a critical relationship. We're at $1.3, $1.5 trillion in goods and services going across the Atlantic. That's key to our economic viability, to our economic future, and we need to revitalize that. I mean, both sides will do better. The other side should do better. It's time for us to act together. And that was what motivated Jim and I. On 3 C's, because one of kind of the 5 recommendations we made, I'll just say this. The 3 C's is a Central European initiated effort to facilitate the development of cross-border energy, transport, and digital infrastructure in the region between the Baltic, Black, and Adriatic Seas. The idea is that infrastructure connectivity is key to economic growth, it's key to economic resilience. And today, I would say the 3 C's initiative actually has an urgency to it, driven by the pandemic crisis. Because we need to drive economic growth, need to drive job creation. And when you're talking about cross-border roads, rail, digital projects, those are job creators. That's infrastructure that's key to growth. And the 3 C's initiative does both. And that's why you ought to be part of which is kind of a transatlantic economic recovery program.
Yeah, wonderful. This is a really useful way to look at things and a very useful way to get the conversation started. And I appreciate all that background. One of my impressions when people talk about the 3 C's initiative is that folks, mostly in Western Europe, aren't really aware of what is going on in Central Europe. And one of the things you point out in one of your pieces is that infrastructure is particularly key in Central Europe, where these countries simply don't have the same level of cross-border linkages that you see in Western Europe, right? Under decades of Soviet mismanagement of the economy and of infrastructure, these countries emerged from the fall of the Berlin Wall without the necessary cross-border linkages and infrastructure that are necessary to get a prosperous economy growing. Ian, if you don't mind, I'll get back to Ian and then we'll get James back in, because I want to ask you just specifically on what you've described. It seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that one of the many rationales for U.S. involvement in Central and Eastern European infrastructure through the PC's initiative is to wean the region off its dependency on Chinese Belt and Road money, right? The presumption being that if America doesn't engage with these countries and help these countries build up their infrastructure, then somebody else will do it, and likely that'll be China. Now, Ian, what is your assessment of what you've seen these countries do during the COVID crisis? Because it seems to me like at least some of these countries have worryingly been turning to China for primarily medical aid, but even some longer-term loans and investments. I was mentioning, we talked previously about how just a few, I believe it was a month ago, Viktor Orban of Hungary was reported to have signed a classified loan deal with Beijing for a rail project that will connect Budapest, his country's capital, to Belgrade. So are you concerned at all that COVID will heighten the incentive for these countries to turn to Chinese money? And how can we counter that?
One, please make the point about, in Central Europe, as you pointed out, was a legacy from Soviet occupation during the Cold War. It hasn't been overcome through the door of cross-border infrastructure. That has rendered Central Europe as a region of economic, it came to economic violence next to each other, but still separated. There's a very little north-south avenues, pipelines, railways. A few major arteries they have are east-west. If you sat on the satellite and looked down on Europe, you would see a spider web of activity in Western Europe and relative barrenness in Central Europe. So the Central Europeans have gone to submission to overcome this. And what's really kind of exciting about it is it's an effort to kind of leverage private capital, leverage the power and activity of Central Europe, the potential in Central Europe, to create a $500 billion deficit in infrastructure by bringing in more direct investment. And even in the pandemic, the Central Europeans are standing up and making investments. They've already got 600 million euros in direct investments into a 3 C's infrastructure fund. You add to that an American commitment of up to $1 billion for this fund and 3 C energy projects. You have the potential of other European IFIs to invest in the 3 C's fund, and you actually have an initiative, Central European initiated, that could actually have the consequence in the effort to address this infrastructural legacy. As for China and Belt and Road, I think part of the reason why the Central Europeans are driving forward on 3 C is because they would rather rely on Western capital than on Chinese capital. COVID has been a big wake-up call in terms of Europe and Central Europe's relationship with China, beginning to recognize there are a lot of streams that comes with Chinese money that are unhelpful and unhealthy, regardless of what Putin is doing. I mean, Putin is actually an outlier in this realm.
By which you mean, Ian, that Hungary is one of the Central European countries that least relies on Chinese investment?
I think Orban is the one who's most open to it. I see, other countries accepting some Chinese investment, but really no more than what you're seeing in the West.
Yeah.
And I would say I see on both sides
Definitely. Definitely. I wonder if, by the way, I will just mention before I turn to James, if in case he's got anything to add to the 3 Cs issue, I will just mention, because Ian, you were just alluding to the fact that back in February, I believe, at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Pompeo pledged, like you were saying, $1 billion essentially to the investment fund that these countries have put together to channel investments to build infrastructure in the region. And I just want to remind folks that 1 month before that, you would co-author a piece that argued for exactly that strategy and that amount. So I'll just say that let's hope that this report will have the same impact on decision makers the previous one seemed to have. James, do you have anything to add to the 3 Cs initiative? And after that, we'll turn to trade.
Well, yeah, I do think it is from an economic support. I do think, first of all, it's important to all of Europe. This is potentially opening up a new north-south corridor of economic activity, which will run from the Nordic countries eventually through Southern Europe into the Black Sea. That is gonna add economic activity across Europe and benefit everybody in the long run, and make Europe as a whole stronger, more economically resilient, and more competitive. So I think all of Europe wins in this. I do think it is part of the strategic competition, and that it's meant to offer not just an alternative to China, but a better alternative to China. It's not about debt, and it's not about being beholden to the Chinese. Indeed, the countries themselves invest in the fund, and I believe Hungary either has or is planning actually on investing in the 3 Cs fund. But these are commercially viable projects. They're investments, not loans. And a matter of fact, one of the requirements of a U.S. participation is it has to meet the requirements of what's called the Blue Dot Network. So this is a framework that the U.S. and several other countries have proposed. You can find it online, just Google it, type in Blue Dot Network, it all comes up. But it's a sense of very, very practical steps that you would take to make sure that these are investments which at the end of the day are going to bring money back to the people in the countries and are going to be bringing prosperity in, not essentially extracting resources out. So I do think it's a real alternative to China.
Definitely, and I'll just mention, by the way, thanks for bringing up the Blue Dot Network, which is another great example of the U.S. kind of providing more of the kind of the technical screening aspect of aid in terms of pointing what are the reliable destinations for global investment to go into. But I was really struck by one thing you do mention in your piece is that another something that's also very unique about the 3 Cs initiative is that the funds are privately managed, right? These are not bureaucrats making decisions where the market would have perhaps made a better decision. These are private sector folks, right? The fund is delegating to them the decision to allocate the funds, right? Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it is set up to be it's a commercial venture with an independent investment fund, and the U.S. investment is it's an investment. I mean, the U.S. hope it makes a return for the money it invests, that it benefits from this, but also the U.S. investment is designed to show confidence in the project, with being not that the other governments and perhaps the European Union, Germany would invest, but also that it's a signal to the private sector that this is a good opportunity. And that private sector money is really going to come in and be the great engine here. And I think that's the real expectation of what the U.S. is hoping for.
If
Wonderful.
I can add to that.
Yeah.
Jim just made an important point. The United States is investing in this. We're going to get a positive return on it because this is a region of 110 million people, with a GDP of $1.7 trillion, and a growth rate over the last 5 years. About 3%. It's projected to be about 3% out to 2030. And they're trying to address a $500 billion deficit in infrastructure. So if something was built in the right place, it's going to be used and it's going to have a positive return. My hope is that it won't be just the United States, and invest in this fund. We'll see Spain, Germany, the UK, France, and other national development banks investing in this fund, because that will enhance, as Jim said, private sector confidence in this initiative, and that will help the Central Europeans leverage the $1 trillion in FDI that circulates around the world to help develop infrastructure while stressing their economies, Europe's economies, and basically the community writ large. So this is an opportunity, but also a strategic imperative for Western Europe as much as the United States.
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful. Well, like we were mentioning at the start, I believe the Thesis Initiative is really just such a fascinating example of how the transatlantic cooperation can deliver great results. And I believe, again, I believe it hasn't gotten enough attention. It doesn't get enough credit, or at least in some corners of in Western European media, you don't hear folks talk about it too much. Let's turn to 5G, because that's another. 5G also plays a big part in your report, James. And I want to ask you kind of how you see the 5G situation in Europe, and whether you think COVID is perhaps going to make other European governments turn away from giving Huawei any role in rolling out 5G infrastructure across the continent. Because I want to remind our audience that Britain was very soon after the pandemic started ravaging, obviously, Europe. One of the decisions that Britain took was to reverse a previous plan that was agreed with Huawei to give Huawei a rather generous percentage of the UK's infrastructure network to be rolled out by Huawei. So they walked that back. Now, in the rest of the continent, it looks to me like we are yet to see that same sort of reversal. Obviously, the EU's member states get to run their own infrastructure networks. Thankfully, that isn't yet delegated to some EU bureaucrat, but the EU does have some guidance that it issues to member states, and where it tells, these are the specific areas of your infrastructure where you should be a little careful with where you go, what companies you bring on board. Do you think, James, that America should play a role in pressuring European countries to slam the door on Huawei? How could it do that?
Yeah, I think what Ian and I have talked about is, as part of our fits right into the U.S.-European economic recovery, is really a plan for creating a free market alternative to Huawei as the provider of 5G infrastructure. And Ian's actually had some very inventive, creative ideas on this, so I'll let him talk about those. But there's an economic reason and a strategic reason why we think this is important. For those of you who don't know much about 5G, it's more than 4G, right? This is a monumental increase in the capacity to process things online. So it's about not just moving much larger masses of data, but moving the capacity to process that data much closer to the source of the data. This is the difference between a rotary phone and a cell phone, the difference between a calculator and a computer. This is a technological transformative leap, maybe that we haven't seen since the 1980s and the invention of the silicon chip. This is a huge deal. This will, so even when people are saying, oh, geez, investments now, oh my God, let's just recover. This is the kind of transformative initiative that can not just get your economy back to where it was, but can leapfrog productivity. So it's incredibly important, the 5G build out. That's the economic argument, and we are natural business partners. So having equitable digital infrastructure between us that we can exploit, that's a no-brainer. So there's an economic argument for that in the transatlantic community. There's a strategic argument as well. And the fundamental concern is this, is the Chinese government has a law, which basically says any information that a Chinese company touches, the Chinese government has legal access to that. That means that anything that flows over a 5G network where Huawei is involved, that essentially that information, as far as the Chinese government concerned, is legitimately information they have access to. And you could say, well, not a big deal for me. I'm going to encrypt everything I do and everything else. Well, the two other big strategic investments by the Chinese Communist Party, in addition to wanting to be the global leader in 5G, are quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Well, why is that important? Because those enable you to process unbelievably massive amounts of data. And the Chinese plan, and we know this is their plan because we've already seen them do this, is they will suck up every bit of data. They will figure out some way to eventually get into that data, utilize it and exploit it, and they will use it and exploit it to the advantage of China. So this is perhaps one of the most significant strategic threats to freedom, prosperity, privacy, and individual liberty, essentially letting China, if this was the 1930s in the United States, we had a very famous bank robber named John Dillinger. It'd be like putting John Dillinger in charge of the bank. Look, I don't blame China for what they're doing. I don't blame Huawei. This is the strategy they have chosen. It's great for them. It's great business for them, but it is a serious danger to the free world. I think that's just fundamentally true. So the question is what do we want to do? Do we want to duplicate what the Chinese are doing and force people not to do something? Or do we want to exploit the advantages that we have in the West, which is a free market competitive society, which is already, if you look, just in the last 24 months, the number of companies that have come online, virtual 5G infrastructure proposals, all kinds of initiatives and creativity. We want to exploit that and have something that is both economically viable, but will give us the degree of security in our telecom infrastructure that we're really accustomed to. And I think Ian's got some great ideas about how maybe that process could be jump-started.
Ian?
All right, do we comment on that?
Sure. We absolutely want you to get in on that and chime in. I'll just remind folks that, it's a very important message you bring, James, because it does look, and I hope you both agree, many times that the debates around 5G in Europe, or in Western Europe at least, tend to be rather naive. And people oftentimes forget just what kind of companies and actors, and you mentioned obviously in this case Huawei and the Chinese Communist Party, what kind of actors we're dealing with, and they tend to overlook the security aspect of it, and they only focus on the economic argument for bringing the Huawei on board. Ian, please go ahead.
Just to add to Jim's point, you want to have a separate thought about China and how we use technology. Just read today's papers and headlines about what Beijing intends to do and begin to execute in Hong Kong. And then very much a strategy is being executed through their use and exploitation of communications technology to hunt down and trap and suppress those who, yearn for freedom, desire freedom, benefit from freedom, want to stay in freedom in that region. So let me on that point. In terms of what we ought to be doing in the transatlantic community, we should first recognize we have the technology. Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, USA, these are all transatlantic firms. And, the Chinese subsidize Huawei. That's why Huawei is economically competitive. We ought to be thinking about how we create market conditions that are conducive to, Europeans and Americans buying into the European and American 5G technology. And the 3C's wrong, but we've suggested is that, the 3C initiative, given emphasis to 5G, they ought to be directing some of their investment funds facilitating the growth of 5G networks in Central Europe. The same approach can be used in Western Europe and the United States. For example, I think the United States ought to create its own kind of fund to help kind of promote development and incorporation of European and American 5G technology into our communication space. Leveraging the same tools that Chinese use to promote Huawei, and the benefit of our own technology, our own security, and our own prosperity.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a very comprehensive take on 5G right there. But I would obviously, again, encourage everyone to go read Ian and James's op-ed on the Hill and the larger Heritage report that preceded it, that James's team put out, which is a longer it really lays out all of these specific points in more detail, and the 5G piece is really interesting. So I encourage folks to head over to the report and take a deeper look. If this is okay with you, we'll turn to trade here, because that's another key part of your program, right? You you give trade liberalization a major role, right, in relaunching the transatlantic economy and helping Europe and America claw themselves out of this crisis together. And everyone knows, folks both on your side of the pond and my side of the pond, everyone knows that the EU and the US have dragged their feet over TTIP for many years, right? The talks are stalled, and the outlook has only worsened really under this administration. In your op-ed, one of the most interesting things I found in your op-ed is that you essentially say that the approach we followed is wrong, and we should brush it aside, and we should instead focus on a more piecemeal approach, because TTIP, what it is it's this sort of all-encompassing trade negotiation. Let's look at all of the sectors together. Let's sit together and try to figure everything out all in one go. And you argue that we should be focusing on more concrete steps, right, a more piecemeal approach to liberalized trade. So let me begin with a very general question, and you can take turns, or whoever feels ready can comment first, and then we'll turn to the other. Do you hope that COVID is going to help get to that reset in trade talks between the EU and the US?
Yeah. Good. Ian, can I start? Would that be okay?
Please.
Yeah. All right. So the short answer is yes. We ought to push a little mythology aside. This notion that somehow TTIP died because President Trump hates Europe and doesn't want a trade deal with Europe. The reality is that negotiation was in deep trouble on both sides, and there was certainly not bipartisan support for it in the United States. And to be honest, there wasn't universal agreement in Europe either. TTIP was going nowhere. Trump didn't kill it. It died a natural death before we showed up. Obviously, this administration does make trade deals, because they've made several big trade deals. U.S.-Mexico, they renegotiated a deal with South Korea, a deal with China. So yeah, this is an administration that likes to do deals. I think our approach is big, comprehensive deals that really harmonize regulatory environments are just completely undoable. And especially now we have to get the economies up and running. We have to do things that are going to jumpstart and hit adrenaline into the economy. So our argument would be find the things that we can do relatively quickly, that would make a difference and create an investor trade environment. I don't know how Ian feels. I think one of the things that we've looked at a lot is digital trade. Maybe we could do a digital trade deal. We have a big paper from the Heritage Foundation coming out on that, heritage.org. It'll probably be out in the relative near future. Kind of deals thing. Obviously, we think a US-UK FTA would benefit everybody in the long deal, would benefit everybody. But I think digital trade makes a much bigger percentage of our economies than GDP actually recognizes. That's important and doable area. And so if I was picking one to US-European negotiators, I would say take that one, run with that quickly, and nail that deal down. But Ian may have other thoughts.
Ian, go ahead.
Just reiterate everything that Jim said. You put it well. There's an urgency that the coronavirus pandemic has created because of the economic devastation. This $1.3, $1.5 trillion trade relationship is key to our recovery. If it remains retarded by lack of connectivity, regulatory requirements, we're not going to get back on our feet as quickly as we can. I'd say also it's going to require a little change in tack on both sides of the Atlantic. In Washington, the Trump administration is going to have to get away from these kind of constant threats of tariffs. It's going to have to back off of those tariffs it's already imposed. It's going to stop threatening, the European German oil industry. There's going to have to be a little bit of ratcheting back of ideological rigidity and overcommitment to regulatory harmonization and green agenda. Those are great objectives, but there's going to have to be some flexibility, at least in the near and medium term, on those objectives, if we're going to get something done, particularly in a more specific way, such as outlined the digital trade agenda. So there's a need. There's also a need for compromise, a little less threat, less threats, and a little less ideological rigidity.
Yeah, definitely. And if I can just add to that. In fact, James, the background you gave was incredibly important. A lot of people seem to sort of, claim that President Trump was the last nail in the coffin of TTIP. When, as you pointed out, it was one of the more it was taking far too long. There didn't seem to be any progress before him in office. So it seems to me like that has just been an excuse for European leaders to kind of justify why it's taken so long. And this is something we will not very often hear on this side of the pond, and I hope you both agree. You rarely hear European leaders reckon with this. The reality is that, in a lot of cases, you see this specifically on trade, but European leaders and EU leaders have let their dislike of President Trump take precedent over the imperative of free trade. This is something that they may not be ready to recognize. And there are a lot of other problems with it, but that is one aspect that does not help, because these leaders seem, at a loss when it comes to kind of letting that, putting their personal dislike of the administration on the side and work on something that is going to benefit both sides. But I want to ask you about the auto tariff and just this administration's general trade policy, and whether that is an impediment to the talks. Because one of the major things that you hear in Europe is that look at President Trump. How come are we to believe that he wants to do a trade deal with us when he's slapping these auto tariffs on European car exports? And how come does he want to create a united front to tackle China's abuses when he's at the same time kind of stabbing us in the back, kind of undermining that common effort by slapping these tariffs? So my question is more precise. Do you think that dropping these auto tariffs and kind of having more of a goodwill approach between Europe and America when it comes to these sectors and trade in general, do you think that's a prerequisite for the trade talks, or do you think that trade talks can go ahead even with these tariffs in place?
Yeah, that's actually probably a good play, at least from my perspective, to kind of sum up what Ian and I have tried and been pushing for. I've never been a fan of the administration's trade tariff strategy. But this is the strategy that this administration has chosen. But I think underlying it is the president uses tariffs to get people's attention, to ratchet up pressure in the trade environment. So I think we recognize it for what it is, which is a tactic that the administration is using. And I think the way to combat that tactic, and that literally every country that has successfully negotiated with President Trump has figured out, is be constructive. Come to the table with a constructive win-win idea that works for both sides, and that will get the attention of this administration. So I think, Ian and I wanted to start a conversation about the transatlantic community, about economic recovery. I think we put just in this thing 3 really solid ideas on the table: invest in 3 C's infrastructure, come up with a free market alternative to 5G, focus on a digital trade agreement. That's a big substantive agenda right there, and a powerful agenda that will have real immediate economic consequences. We were excited. If other people want to put ideas on the table, great. But here's the thing is, I don't hear people talking about this. I particularly do not hear Europeans saying, let's talk about transatlantic economic recovery and what we can do with America together to move forward. And I think if they did that, that would reset the whole conversation. And I think this administration and I think Americans are ready to listen to that. We can sit and we can whine and complain about the past all day long, or we can say, what can we all do together right now to get our economies up and running as quickly as possible? I think the people in Washington are more than willing to listen to that. I think those 3 things we laid out are a great starter. We can start on those tomorrow, and we can fold other things in the conversation. But we need to hear from the other side, Europeans, and we need it to be constructive. And that's all I'll say.
And well, that's a really it's a message that these people really need to hear. I mean, it doesn't seem like trade negotiators on the European side have that sort of win-win mentality, that constructive strategy of coming to the table with things that they can trade away for concessions and terms. So that's a very helpful message. Ian, do you want to chime in on the trade issue?
You know, I would just kind of take a step higher or broader, and I would just say I think what Jim said is absolutely correct. You know, when I think of where we are today, I'm surprised by the dearth of discussions and proposals when it comes down to one, what can the two sides of the Atlantic do together to address the health crisis? Second, what can we do together to address the economic consequences of this pandemic? Help us dig out of this recession we find ourselves in. The numbers are extreme. I mean, 6%, 8% decline in our GDP. It's huge. And then third, what should we be doing together as a transatlantic community of democracies to prepare for the next pandemic? That involves things like, you know, adjusting our supply chains so that they're more mutually reinforcing, thinking about how we can think about transatlantic stockpiles, how we can more effectively coordinate on a nation-to-nation basis, on a multinational institutional basis, you know, NATO, EU, so that we're better prepared for the next hit, because there will be another pandemic.
Definitely, and it's very useful too to kind of broaden the lens, like you've just done, Ian, and kind of focus on all the other things that we could also be working together on to do all the things you've mentioned. Let me turn. In fact, I'll just take the opportunity to ask folks, whoever's is tuned into this webinar, and we've got an audience from hopefully folks from both your side of the pond, our side of the pond. We've got folks from all over the place. I'm going to start asking them to fill their questions because we're leaving the remaining 15 minutes or so of the hour for Q&A with the audience. So folks will be able to send us their questions to either James or Ian or both. I'll be fielding their questions to you in turn. So I'll ask folks to get started with their questions right now, so we don't have to rush towards the end of the session. And I do have one last question before we turn to the Q&A. My question, in fact, Ian, I know you've done a fair amount of work on China's misinformation efforts and how the inroads they're making in Europe. And my question is about public opinion in Europe. You think that faced with China's handling of the virus, right, the cover-up, the way that China's handling of the virus was delayed the world's response. And then when you add on top of that all the disinformation, you would think that when faced with all of that, European countries would cut a more China skeptic line. You would think that there would be more resentment, if not, skepticism. And yet on March 25th, and you wrote in the New Atlanticist, you wrote this aid blitz, and you were referring to the outpour of Chinese medical aid to some of the countries in Europe that were hardest hit by the virus. You said, this aid blitz is intended to position China as the great power that came to the rescue and to reverse Europeans' growing concern about Beijing's authoritarianism and its larger ambitions in the region. But, a few months already into the pandemic, you're seeing two rather worrying trends, right? And this is what I'd like to get you to comment on. First of all, you see public opinion in some countries is turning more, not less, friendly to China. And I haven't looked at the specific data for all the countries, but I do know that in some places, I think there was a public opinion poll done in Italy that showed, and this perhaps has a lot to do with all the aid that Italy has received from China, but in Italy, you saw growing numbers of Italians regard China more favorably, not less. And then the second worrying trend is that we've seen EU diplomats cave in, essentially, to Chinese bullying and hardball tactics. We saw it in the case of a disinformation report that was going to be put out by the EU's diplomatic arm. You've seen it with an op-ed that the EU was going to run in the Chinese state-owned media company. So let me ask you both of this. Maybe we'll start with Ian and then we'll turn to James. Why do we think that is? What has gone wrong? Why do you think that some Europeans are turning? Because while they're turning more friendly to China, they're also turning skeptical of the U.S. and even more so because that is a trend that started under the Trump administration. So what do you think has gone wrong, and what can we do to reverse this?
Well, one, I'm not going to argue with the facts you have in the polls, but I think those polls tend to be national polls, the ones that I've seen, so they're not really kind of reflective of all of Europe. They reflect specific communities within Europe. And second, the polls, they're a reflection of the moment. What I've noticed in Europe, and I'm interested to be corrected, and I'm correct, is that there's actually been a hardening of attitudes towards China, certainly among political elites and among governments. 18 months ago, most governments in Europe were more than happy to treat China as an economic partner, regardless of what it's doing in the South Pacific, how it is conducting aggression against its neighbors. That was a distant problem. They were more interested in the economic relationship. I think that's changed. Last year, the European Union defined China as a strategic competitor, an ideological competitor, a technological competitor. This is an EU document. Just last December, at the NATO summit, NATO heads of state, which of course are predominantly European, issued a declaration saying that China is a competitor, a challenge. NATO is undergoing a reflection process right now, defining its role, its purpose, its mission. And a big focus of that is what should NATO's role be in a transatlantic strategy regarding China. I think this COVID crisis has been a big wake-up call for Europe. One, a lot of the material that came from China was actually faulty. They were sending bad products. Second, a lot of the products they sent were divergent, not only from buyers in the United States, but also in Europe. So that means you can't even trust these guys. And in turn, the Europeans have been shocked by the disinformation campaigns coming from China. And fourth, while some of them may have been cowed by Chinese pressure, it doesn't mean they appreciate that pressure. That generates resentment and suspicion and concern. So I think actually we're now at a very important inflection point in the transatlantic community, one that creates a real opportunity to develop a comprehensive transatlantic posture regarding China's emergence. And I'm hoping our leaders in Washington and Brussels and Rome and Israel will seize that moment.
Yeah, definitely. So Ian seems to be painting a rosier picture, and as you said, some of these public opinions may very soon begin to point in a different direction. But Ian, it seems like Ian is generally optimistic that we can build a united front, both at the government level and at the public opinion level. We can really, see eye to eye on the Chinese threat. James, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be overly Pollyannish. I think even if people see a challenge that's represented by China, people are still not just in Western Europe, but around the world, reticent, reluctant to deal with that. If you complain, you get enormous pressure from the Chinese. Conversely, the Chinese want to do everything possible, essentially, to convince people that they're not a challenge. So I agree with Ian. I think there has been a sea change, but let's not pretend that we're all of one mind on China yet. But I think that China has faced a significant challenge in the last 12 to 18 months that is not just a bump in the road. And I think the U.S. is going to continue to highlight Chinese malfeasance and destabilizing activity. And the U.S. is going to continue to stand up and push back where Chinese activity is impinging on U.S. interests. That isn't going to stop. And so that tension is going to become starker. And I think it's healthy and constructive. And I'll give one brief example. The U.S. administration got a lot of criticism for its abrupt withholding of funds from the World Health Organization, and followed up by the president saying, well, if they don't essentially clean up their act in 30 days, we'll pull all our money. The administration did that to really make the case that Chinese influence on the WHO has been mendacious and not helpful in terms of dealing with the global pandemic. Look what's happened in response to that. Even if people agreed or disagreed with the misadministration, liked or didn't like the decision or whatever, we've seen, for example, over a dozen countries come up and say that Taiwan, which had observer status in the World Health Organization and which was one of the most effective responders to the pandemic outbreak, was kicked out of that in 2016 at the insistence of the Chinese government. We've now seen over a dozen countries demand that China be allowed to come back into the WHO at observer status. We've seen, I think, over 100 countries have signed up for an independent investigation of the World Health Organization's role. It's kind of a unanswerable question because it's kind of a counterfactual thing, but would countries have stood up on the WHO as strongly demanding transparency and accountability if the United States hadn't taken such a strong and powerful stand? I don't know. And we can be very critical of our European friends saying, they pulled their punches on this letter or whatever, but clearly, as Ian, I think, rightly points out, Europeans recognize that they have a China challenge as well. One common refrain I hear from many Europeans is where we really went wrong was China was dealing bilaterally with all of us, and they were really employing a divide and conquer strategy, playing one off against another, trying to get friendly here, and that really undermined the general European interests and values, and that as difficult as this is, collectively, we are going to have to deal with China. And I know there are still people that say, well, we don't want to get in the middle between a battle between China and the United States. I don't think this is a question of being an impartial observer here. I don't believe Europe is an impartial observer. I mean, they don't have to agree with everything in the United States. We don't have to have common policies, none of that. But fundamentally, we believe in governments elected by their people. We believe in inalienable human rights, and we believe in the virtues of the free enterprise system. The reality is, and we all know this, the Chinese Communist Party does not believe in any of those things. And if we don't defend those core interests, they will not survive in the face of a rising China. Doesn't mean we need to decouple with China. Doesn't mean we need to go to war with China. It doesn't mean we need to bow down to China. It means that we have to have the strength and confidence to stand up for the things that we really believe in, and put aside our partisan squabbles, differences, everything else, when they begin to endanger our capacity to really protect the things that are truly the most important to us, that define who we are as free peoples.
Definitely, and that's a very good note on which to end this whole chapter of our conversation on China. I believe on that much you would be able to get a majority of people on both sides of the pond to agree with that specifically on the limited few things that we do unquestionably share and agree on it, and those things can really garner a large majority on both sides of the pond. If I can just, Ian, I was really interested by one of the things you mentioned, and I want to go back to it before we turn to questions. We've got a range of questions from the audience, and we'll be turning to them in a second. But Ian, I was really interested, you were mentioning to the instances, and again, this is something that Ian has been writing about recently, the instance where we saw EU diplomats cave in essentially. The reports are contested, but essentially what the New York Times reported was that EU diplomats caved in to intense pressure by Chinese diplomats to tone down a report that the EU was going to put out where it was going to expose disinformation efforts by China. And I was really interested by how you framed it, saying that, okay, well, even if the end result was that they caved, at least these diplomats are also starting to feel the heat and the pressure of an ever more aggressive China, and at least the realization that China is increasingly aggressive should change their minds. And I want to please chime in if you want to, Ian. I'll just add to that from a European perspective, we have been hearing from the EU for decades that the only reason that European nations could pull their weight together and essentially be a strategic force in the world was by having the EU. And a lot of Europeans, when we saw that specifically, were telling themselves, well, why do we have the EU after all? If the EU isn't going to stand up to China, why do we have like, if we didn't have any reactions to that, no printed questions.
You know, I don't know the details published on the Chinese EU op-ed was supposed to be published in the Chinese government journal. My sense is that there was a screw up in the EU embassy in Beijing, and I think people are making a mountain out of a molehill out of that. It was unfortunate. They shouldn't have conceded that. They should have pushed the piece elsewhere. And so I'm not over-interpreting that particular instance. But it does show that the Chinese are unwilling to take constructive criticism, and that's and how forcefully they respond to any sort of criticism. And it's not just the EU delegation, the EU. The States have felt this pressure, the Greeks have felt this pressure. This is a reality of how China is exercising its economic power. And I think more Europeans are now aware of this. And it makes me somewhat optimistic that we should actually start developing a comprehensive strategy towards China. You know, a strategy that marshals the ideological, military, and economic power that we have on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful. Well, we've got, it's all very useful. We've got a few questions from the audience, and we are actually slightly past the hour. I believe that the topic was so fascinating that we went slightly over time. But we can put some questions here, and I'll give maybe a little background question, and whoever wants to respond, please feel free to go ahead. The first question is about the UK. The first question says, not so long, this is the background that is not displayed on the screen, which is why I'm reading it. Not so long ago, when we talked about, US-Europe relations, we knew what we were referring to. Today, however, there are two partners for the US on the other side of the ocean, the EU and the UK. So the question is, are US-UK relations more important in both trade and foreign policy than US-EU relations? So which partnership is more important to America, the UK or the EU?
Yeah. First of all, I have to apologize. I've got to drop in like 8 minutes for another, so I'll be gone. But look, I think they're both important. I mean, our think tank, the Heritage Foundation, we were actually supportive of Brexit. We think that this is going to make Europe stronger. Certainly, the U.S.-UK relationship has always been special. I think the U.S.-EU relationship is important and going to get more important in the future. And I actually think we're all going to benefit from this. I think the U.K. is going to be the bridge between Europe and the United States. I think in many ways, the UK, Europe will have to compete to stay up with the UK in some of these things. So I think they're going to be fine, but I don't think I completely reject the notion that it's either or. It was both. It's been both since 1917, and it's not going to change.
Definitely. Ian, if you want to chime in.
Sure. I kind of missed a little bit of this because I was cut off.
Oh.
But, on the UK-EU relationship, I personally think this is a mistake for the UK pursue Brexit. I think they're going to be hurt geopolitically and economically in significant ways. But, water has crossed over that dam now. And that's why I stand with Jim now saying, we ought to be thinking about how to manage the situation. And that means we need to get the EU and the UK to kind of realign their trading relationship and lead the United States and the EU to develop a trade agreement so that we can, be more mutually reinforcing in the trade realm.
Wonderful. Well, James has got to go, and we'll let him go to his next commitment. I just want to thank folks who have been sending their questions, and we've got we've got one more. Let's do one last question. We can take 30 seconds if that much. The question is, how what does Europe have to offer to the U.S.? We tend to look. We've been looking at how strategically engaging with Europe is beneficial to Europe, to America. What does Europe have to offer America? It seems to me the question is, does Europe have anything to offer the U.S. and what is it?
Yeah, I'll answer that real quick, and then I think I'm speaking for both Ian and I. I think we would both actually love to come back and dialogue more and talk about more of these things. So there's three critical parts of the world to the United States because we're a global power with global interests and responsibilities. So at the end of the day, vital interests to us are a peaceful and stable Western Europe, peaceful, stable, and prosperous Middle East, peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. We want all three of those things. So the number one is the more self-confident, the more successful, the more prosperous, the more secure Western Europe is, the better that is for the United States, both because our economies are intertwined, but also that because then it allows us to focus on other issues. So I would say absolutely, from a rebooting the American economy perspective, totally critical. From a more secure and safe world, a prosperous, safe and secure and whole Western Europe, absolutely vital to the United States. I think there are other areas where the United States and Europe have mutual interest and can do a lot together. I think Africa is a good example. I think China's influence in Africa is destabilizing. I think Europe has an interest there because the problems of Africa will spill over into the Middle East and will spill into Western Europe. I think we want Africa to be stable and prosperous. I think that's an area where the two of us could work together. I think that's a critically important theater for a U.S.-European cooperation. I'm sure there are others. I'll leave that to Ian, and I'm gonna depart. But thank you for having me, and I know we would both love to come back. Thanks again.
Wonderful, thank you, James. Really appreciate that. Ian, if you wanna add anything to that, and we'll wrap up.
Sure. When I think of the transatlantic community, I think a community that's unmatched in three realms of power that we can work together. In the first realm is military power. There is no community of nations, and this is done through NATO, that can match the historic military success record that the NATO alliance has brought. And that is an organization that combines the U.S. and European military power, of course, Canadian. Second, economic power. When we stand together, we have roughly a $30 to $35 trillion economy. That dwarfs that of any of our allies or adversaries, including China. Russia's $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion. China's about $14 trillion. So we marshal our economic resources together, we can be unstoppable. And then finally, we have the important military card, the political military card of having a shared commitment to democracy and democratic values. That is an ideological spirit that's invaluable to leveraging our political, our economic, and military power. The transatlantic community combines all three of those in ways that no other nation or no other alliance can match. That's invaluable. We should treasure it, and we should leverage it.
Wonderful. That's a wondrous and very optimistic note to end on. We thank James, who had to drop out of the call just a minute ago, but I want to thank you, Ian, for tuning into this and sharing your time and your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to having you on another occasion in the future. And thanks to all of our audience, folks who've been tuning into the session and listening to James and Ian. So again, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, all right. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you.